Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Stephen King podcast. This is episode 108, and Bryant Burnette has generously agreed to reappear and help me do a couple of reviews and chew the fat over a couple of news items. Hey, Bryant, how you doing?
Hey, Lou, how are you?
Not too bad. So are you guys in full lockdown mode, or they start relax things a little bit?
We are sort of in an in-between stage, I believe. Some things have started to open back up, and some things are still not any different than they have been for weeks.
Right.
I'm mostly just staying at home, so I'm okay doing that.
Right. Yeah, it's the same for us. It's different from province to province, and I from the news I understand it's kind of the same in the States too. So they're letting the states, their governors, decide how open they're supposed to be. Even here, they're doing the same thing with our premiers. But I think most people are just still pretty hesitant to mix and mingle. But fortunately, in podcast land, that's not an issue because it's all virtual and can still have our conversations without worry of infecting each other. And at least that kind of disease hasn't come to life yet. Maybe someday that will, I don't know. But for now, we seem to be safe on the internet. So that's good.
That sounds like a Stephen King story.
You think, eh? Jeez. Yeah. All right. So what we've got going on today is we're going to do a couple of reviews, two collections, actually. One a Joe Hill collection and the other one a Stephen King collection. So we'll be reviewing Throttle, and then we'll review If It Bleeds.
Welcome. Do not fear the door that lies before you. We will protect you. We are your guides, Hans and Lou, and we will give you the latest in Stephen King news. But before we do so, you must prove yourself worthy. You must open the door and join us in the Deathroom.
So before we do that, I have a couple of news items that were pretty big that I wanted to cover because they're just recent announcements of adaptations of Stephen King projects and actually Joe Hill projects too. So I haven't run these by Bryant yet, so I'm just sure he's probably seen the announcements, but I'm just curious for his reactions on each one of them. First up, let's talk about The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. This is being adapted by Village Roadshow, and it's being scripted by Christy Hall. So this is very much in the pre-production phase, and I'm not sure if this is going to be on Netflix or not, but because Christy Hall has some producing creds, and she was a co-creator of the series, which I haven't seen yet on Netflix, I Am Not Okay With This, which I believe stars the girl from It, and she's kind of like a Carrie-powered teenager. So I haven't watched that yet. Have you seen that series?
I actually have, yeah.
Yeah.
I had a couple of friends recommend it to me, so I checked it out, and I thought it was really good.
Okay, yeah, it's on my to-watch list. I just haven't got around to it yet, so I'm looking forward to seeing that. But as far as Tom Gordon goes, this would be a very meaty role for I don't know if they're going to age up the girl, because in the book, Tricia McFarland is 12 years old, but whoever gets this part, man, oh man, this could be like a Kathy Bates, Annie Wilkes screen debut for whoever this actor is going to be. And that's really what it's going to all come down to, is how great of an actor they can find to play this part.
My guess is that they'll sort of cast a wide net in the audition process and just look for whoever is the best person for the role. Yeah, and then adjust the age accordingly.
Yeah.
I think if you went into it firmly set in your mind that you were going to have the character be, I think she's 9 in the book. According
to what I'm reading, it says she's 12 in the book.
Okay.
I don't think you can go much older than, you want to keep it below teenage 8 years, because at a certain point, if the character's too mature, then I think it'll lose some of its power.
Yeah, there's a big difference between a little girl lost in the woods story and a teenager lost in the woods story. That's not one of my favorite King books, so I'm not sure that it's going to make a whole lot of difference to me which way they go with that. But I know a lot of people love it. So.
I was, because, it's always great, the 2020 hindsight, but if this would have been like a perfect role for somebody like a 12-year-old Haley Stanfield, because I remember her first screen role was in True Grit, and she just really blew me away. I'm hoping that whoever they cast for this part I'll have that same kind of experience. If this gets made, it's in pre-production phase, and a lot of things can happen until the camera starts rolling, but we'll have to see. But really, this one comes all down to whoever gets cast to play the main character. I think it'll rise or fall based on the talent of that person.
Yeah, and one thing that I found myself thinking about is, will they change the title? Does anybody know who Tom Gordon is at this point? I mean, he was a fairly notable player, but that was, 20 years ago? Again,
because I haven't read the book in a while, but was cell phone use very big in that time period? I don't know.
Came out in 99, so cell phones existed. I think I had one by then, but I wouldn't swear to it.
Because that's the thing that they're going to have to deal with. Because if she has a cell phone, then there's no story. She has to be too young maybe to have a cell phone. I don't know. But I'm sure they'll come up with something for that. But that'll be interesting. And as your point about Tom Gordon, I don't know. He was a reliever, right, for the Boston Red Sox, MLS?
Yes. Let's go with yes. I think so.
Baseball fans out there, please don't get mad. I'm not a baseball fan. If I had to watch any sport, it would be hockey because I'm Canadian. So you know where I'm coming from.
If it came down to it, I would pay you to let me not watch baseball. Okay,
so there you go.
But
there goes that's just 90% of our audience, probably. But I don't really see an issue with that if they change it to make it something more relevant. But again, I think this is a time period dependent story as well. Kids are so tied to their cell phones. I don't know what they're going to do there, if they're going to make it current or make it in a time period when cell phone use wasn't that prevalent. But we'll have to see.
Yeah, I don't know.
All right. And then next up is HBO Max is going to produce a version Stephen King, Joe Hill's Throttle novella. And this, I don't know why I want to call it, I always thought it was Full Throttle. Was it just Throttle? Okay, good, because I was getting confused between the collection and the novella. So this is a pretty cool story. It's got that duel vibe for me from Spielberg's first film. So I think this would be pretty cool and you could have a really cool father-son dynamic going along here as well. So this we'll have to see how far this gets as well. But this one wouldn't be that expensive either, which is attractive to whoever ends up adapting this as well. So you could do some pretty cool stuff with this and give it a real duel vibe.
Yeah, the duel comparison is completely appropriate. I don't know if you know this, but the story originally appeared in an anthology of Richard Matheson themed stories called He Is Legend.
Yep.
And it was purposefully done as a duel homage.
Yeah.
So I would hope that whoever ends up directing the movie would look to Spielberg's duel in the same way that King and Hill did with Matheson's story.
Right.
And just have it be balls to the wall action thriller.
Yeah.
And I think if you, it probably could be done cheaply, but I'd kind of like to see it a lot of really ambitious stunts and effects, and for it all to be location filming on deserted highways and whatnot. If you do that, I think you could end up with something pretty exciting cinematically.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So that's another one to keep your eyes on. And the final big adaptation that was announced recently was Mike Flanagan is going to work on a adaptation of the Stephen King novel Revival. And he's doing that with his writing partner, Trevor Macy. They worked together on the excellent adaptation of Dr. Sleep. And I have to be very honest that I enjoyed Revival, but I fell prey to the marketing campaign, which said this was the scariest thing he had written since Pet Sematary, and it wasn't. But I've never really been able to get over that setup. And so my expectations have always been a little bit tampered because of that. And I enjoyed it enough. I mean, it's a Lovecraft, basically ends up being a Lovecraftian type of horror story. And the interplay between the two characters, the protagonist and the father, is interesting in that King refers to it as a certain type of dramatic of device where two people keep crossing paths, not remembering what that term was off the top of my head. But I mean, this would be a slow build-up type of story that would have a pretty balls-to-the-wall type of climax, I guess you could say. But it could be a pretty creepy story because lightning and that, you can obviously make some very visually dramatic sequences as well. So the only thing that we're not sure of at this point is whether or not Flanagan will actually direct it.
Certainly, I would hope that he would, because I'm happy to see Mike Flanagan direct literally anything at this point, especially any Stephen King story.
Yeah.
But if he decided to just write it and then pass it off to someone else, I do also trust him to find someone who would direct it in the style that he would want it directed.
Right.
So
yeah,
I'm probably a little more positive on the book than you are. So I think this could be pretty great.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed. I guess the issue with Flanagan is now he's got a lot on his plate. He's doing I'm assuming his duties with Bly Manor for Netflix are probably done now, because that one should be airing soon. I think maybe this October.
I remember seeing somewhere that he said that one was completely in the can and basically ready to go. So
yeah,
hopefully it'll be in October.
Yes. And he's also working on adapting a series of books, or I believe it's a series of books called the YA series, The Midnight Club, 1994 teen horror book by Christopher Pike. I have to admit, I'm not familiar with this property at all. When I saw the announcement, it's kind of sounded like Hardy Boys horror story setting, but I'm not sure if that's an accurate description or not. So I have to check this out. I'm not aware of this series. Are you?
I know of the name Christopher Pike, but
I do too. But that's Star Trek.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Good point. But yeah, beyond that, I've never read anything of him.
Yeah, so I'll have to check that out. Interesting. I mean, Flanagan's has a pretty cool slew of properties that he's fans of, and that. So if he likes this, it's got me intrigued enough to check it out, even if it is for a younger audience. But it should be interesting. Anyhow, we'll keep our fingers crossed on the revival adaptation. I was really hoping that he was going to do Doom McKee, but
there's always time.
There's always time. That's right. And then the final thing that I want to bring up, but this is not an adaptation, but this is an upcoming podcast that is going to kick off from Bloody Disgusting on May 29th, and it's going to be a 6-episode limited series podcast hosted by Jason Seacrest, who's done some pretty awesome articles on Stephen King, and he's a writer of in his own right. So this is called The Company of the Mad. The Stand podcast will debut on Friday, May 29th, 2020 at thestandpodcast.com, and he's got a pretty heady lineup of guests. He's got Mike Flanagan, Tana Reeve Dew, and Anthony Bresnikan, who used to write for, was it EW, I think? So that's 6-episode podcast, and they're going to do, it sounds like they're doing the unabridged version, and they're going to do 200 pages for each podcast. So that sounds like fun. And just wanted to give everybody a heads up to mark that podcast down and subscribe to it so that you can check it out. I believe if you go to the site, there will also be a YouTube version of it there as well. So I'm looking forward to listening to what all those folks have to say about the Stand. I don't know if they have any inside info on the upcoming CBS All Access series or not. We'll have to see.
Yeah, I'll definitely be tuning in for that.
Yeah, were you aware of that?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
There is one other bit of movie news that we should cover, though.
Okay.
Children of the Corn.
Oh my God, yes.
They're coming back. And this isn't just a rumor. This is actually filming. Yeah. And it's even filming right now. It's one of the very few projects that's in active production at the moment.
Yeah, unbelievable.
Yeah, I can see why you forgot that.
Yeah, tried to do purposely. Let me just quickly pull up the links here. So this is filming in Australia, as you mentioned. Lucas Foster, Ford versus Ferrari. Well, director Kurt Wimmer, Equilibrium, which is an underappreciated movie. Ultraviolet,
which is not.
No. Because they're shooting outdoors, they got exemptions to general quarantine rules, and they're following the appropriate safety protocols. And I have no idea why this property, out of all of them, of Stephen King's, has been adapted so many times or had so many projects spring from it. It's just, I mean, the original one has somewhat certain merits to it, but really can't say anything after that has proven worthwhile. And I don't know why this team thinks that they can bring something to it that the other ones haven't. It's just, I don't know. They've all been too corny for my tastes. Sorry, I had to go there.
Yeah, it's pretty baffling, to be honest, because this isn't even the first remake. This will be the second remake.
Yeah.
And surely it can't be worse than the first remake was. The first remake is just dreadful.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so that's all the news. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention? Or
I think that's it.
This is great. What's our job? We'd like drive around, pick up stiffs or what?
It's time for reviews from the night shift.
Okay, cool. So let's move over to our reviews of the first of two books. The first one is by Joe Hill, and it is a collection of short stories called Full Throttle. And I don't know off the top of my head how many short stories are in here. Let's see if we get a quick 13 short stories. Some of these have been previously published. Throttle with Stephen King. Let's see what else is here. In the Tall Grass, also with Stephen King. So I know of those two. I don't know if any of the other ones were previously published.
Yeah, almost all of them were. I think the only originals, the ones that are original to this collection, are Fawn and Late Returns.
Okay. So some of the other ones were printed in...
No, I'm sorry. Late Returns and Mums.
Okay. See, I knew that was the reason I had you on. When you say previously published, I should have said, I realize that probably they've been printed in magazines or shorts or whatever. Original stories would be ones that have never been previously printed anywhere. So that's all right. So off the top, I think I'm an outlier on this one, so I'd like to hear your thoughts on this collection as a whole before we start delving into specific stories.
Well, my thoughts on it as a whole is that it's just terrific collection.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a single story in it that I didn't basically love.
Mm.
So it's very similar to 20th Century Ghosts, Hill's first collection in that regard. I don't know if this one's better than that one. It's kind of a night shift skeleton crew situation for me where I really don't know which one I would pick, and luckily I don't live in a world where I have to. so yeah, I thought it was just tremendous.
Okay, that's what I figured you were going to say. I struggled with this collection quite a bit. I mean, if you take out the two ones that he did with Stephen King, Throttle and In the Tall Grass, I struggled with, especially Wolverton Station and Fawn. I really struggled with those two stories. The other ones are not bad. I guess my biggest critique of Wolverton Station is that it's a train story where somebody gets on a train and ends up going to an unusual place, let's say. And my problem with that one is that it's twofold. I'm not a big fan of satire as a storytelling trope or type, especially novels. Like, that's why I'm not a big fan of, like, say, Terry Pratchett or somebody like that. I know the stuff that I shouldn't say I'm not a fan. I recognize his talent and his ability to write that type of story, especially in novel length, which is very difficult to do. But for me, that kind of humor or style of writing, it works. It's kind of like the difference between a Saturday Night Live skit versus a Saturday Night Live movie, if you know what I mean. A lot of times these things are just bloated out to fill out a movie running time, and my tolerance level for that kind of storytelling, it's just not my style. So that's one of the problems I have with Wolverton Station, and I think that the satire in this one is pretty on the nose. And the other one is, there's a lot of other types of stories. This is almost like a subgenre. People getting out of training, ending up in a weird destination. And there's so many other stories that have been done like this that I just think are way better. So that's my biggest problem with that one. And with Fawn, the idea was cool, but there's not one likable character in the whole story. So it's kind of like, who am I rooting for here? There was nobody that I liked in that story. So that's the story where people go through a magic door basically and into a fairyland and kill magical creatures and bring them back as big game hunters. So cool idea, but I just didn't like the execution of that story. So I wonder what your thoughts were on those two stories.
Well, with Wolverton Station, I'll confess that it didn't occur to me that it was satirical. It's not how I read it at all. I read it more as and this is probably not the last time I'm going to use this comparison, but I read it more as an EC type story.
Okay.
Where it was about a guy who not that great a guy.
Yeah.
Who ends up getting a comeuppance that's appropriate to the ways in which he's lived his life.
Mm-hmm.
As for Fawn, somewhat similar. This is about a bunch of really bad people who go and do a bunch of really bad things and have it turn back on them in pretty spectacular ways.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's pointing out exactly my issues with those stories, is that there's no likable characters in those stories. So I just can't get into the story then.
How does that, and not to be combative on it, sure. But how does that differ from something like The Raft?
The Raft? Well, I guess the difference with The Raft is the creature in The Raft was a new and unique thing to me, especially at that time, this living oil slick. Whereas just like getting on the train and going to another destination that's not part of the real world is I've read many, as I've said before, many other stories in that genre. So I just found the wolf on Wall Street vibe that I was getting from this story that just didn't work for me. So
it does sort of seem like Joe Hill might have listened to Werewolves of London and said, "Hey, I can do something with that."
Yeah. And and then Fawn, it's just basically I have the same issue. There's not any likable characters in that story, and not even the magical creatures are actually that likable either. So
yeah,
it's just I had no hook. I had no entry point into either one of those stories. Was my biggest issue with them. So,
well, these things strike you the way they strike you.
Yeah. Dark Carousel was, it was sort of like sometimes they come back kind of vibe, I guess you could say, a little bit. A bunch of teenagers do something bad and they're haunted by those events for the rest of their lives, and they're basically hunted and killed as well. So it was okay. But again, nothing really new or unique about the story. And again, almost really no likable characters.
That does seem to be a recurring theme with Joe Hill.
Yeah, for sure. By the Silver Water of Lake Champlain, this was actually a pretty cool story. And for the first time, I think there was actually some likable characters in here. But then they're kids, so it's much easier to be sympathetic to their plight. I just like it's basically a story about a Loch Ness monster type of creature dying on the beach. But this, I think it's more of a baby, and kids coming across it and finding it instead of it being a happy, wondrous experience, it turns out to be quite a tragic experience for them. So I thought that was actually pretty cool.
Yeah, I like that story a lot. That one originally appeared in an anthology that was a tribute to Ray Bradbury. Yeah. So this is Hill consciously doing Bradbury, and he does it pretty well, I would say.
Yeah, for sure. I really like that one. And then for me, and I think this is probably, if I remember our previous conversations, this is probably your least favorite. This is my favorite story. This one story to me is worth buying the whole collection for, and that was Late Returns. And it's basically about a magical library bus and people coming back to return books that are overdue, and this bus driver is able to help give them closure on whatever life issues that they were struggling with at the time they were reading these books. So I thought it was definitely a sentimental tale, but it strikes me almost as this is Joe Hill's version of the Shawshank Redemption in a way, and the theme of hope and the magic of imagination and so forth. So I really love the story, and maybe this is a story because I'm older, I can appreciate the sentiment behind it, because older you get, there's regrets that you have that you wish you could go back and rectify.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, to be clear, I thought this was a great story.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So I don't know.
Well, no, it may be my least favorite in the book.
Oh, okay.
But those are not conflicting sentiments.
Sure. Okay.
And the only reason I think that it might be my least favorite is because it just seems to have not stuck with me all that much for whatever reason.
Right.
But that's not necessarily a reflection on the story. I may have just done a bad job reading it. But the brief notes that I took on it after reading it were, hey, this is great.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Why don't you tell me your thoughts about All I Care About Is You?
That one might be my favorite in the collection. And I gather from things that I've read and heard elsewhere that would probably be in a minority with that, but that's all right. I'm content with that.
Okay.
What about you?
Again, not really any likable characters in here, except probably for the robot. But yeah, it's strange. And maybe I'm just old fashioned, but like this girl, she's basically just a brat. And she's very self-centered, self-indulgent. And you think that she's starting to make a connection with this robot and starting to expand her worldview to more than just her own egocentric, self-centered viewpoint. But then Joe Hill does a 180 at the end, and she trashes the robot and carts away the pieces that she's interested in, and that's basically it. So yeah, it's those. I need somebody to hang. I need somebody to cheer for. Who am I supposed to cheer for in these stories?
You just pinned down the reason why I love this story. Everything that happened at the end was what clinched it for me as being great.
Mm-hmm.
I'm probably a more cynical person than you,
right?
Would be my guess.
Uh-huh.
I read it essentially the same way, which is that, hey, this is a really cool little buddy story about a girl and her robot. Oh, wait, she just killed the robot. But this girl lives in a pretty brutal world. And this robot, he's just a machine. He's just a tool to get her to what she needs to get to.
Right.
So I thought it was pretty cool that here's this little girl who maybe isn't really so little a girl, because she's doing the things that it takes for her to survive in this horrific world that she lives in. And if that means she's got to bust up a thing that's just a piece of machinery, she's going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I totally see what you're saying.
Yeah. And talking to you has helped clarify why I struggled with this collection as much as I did, because I think so far the only story that really had likable characters in them was Late Returns. So and that trend is going to continue, the unlikable characters. Or actually, this one is actually not bad, Thumbprint, because it deals with a character that at least has, like, she's basically military, and she's back stateside, and she did some pretty bad stuff while she was overseas, and she's struggling to find a life back in the civilian world. And she makes a connection, and you almost think that she's going to do it, but basically she has the same arc as the girl did in the previous story. She just goes back to her whole old ways and kills.
Doesn't seem to end as well for her.
Yeah. So
how did you feel about the story not really having a resolution?
It's like the fifth step, isn't it?
In a way, yeah. That's not a bad comparison.
Yeah, so I don't mind that, like, because some history repeats, right? So violence begets violence, and that's what the story is about. I did find that this character Mal had, because of her background, you were able to build up sympathy for her or empathy for her because of what she had been through. So actually, yeah, this story I thought was one of the better ones. I quite liked Thumbprint. So that was pretty good. What do we got next? The Devil on the Staircase. This was interesting stylistically and story-wise. If you haven't read the story, it's typed in a way that each sentence is a staircase. So it'll start with one or two words, and then the next line will be a bit longer. So basically you have like a descending or ascending lines of text on each page. And sometimes he mixes them right up so that they go down and back up like a valley. So it's pretty unique. I thought it was actually a pretty cool story. So this was one that I quite enjoyed.
Yeah, the first time I read that was it appeared in the back of the paperback edition of Horns that I have, which was a pretty good place for it. And I mean, in some ways, it's just an experimental story.
Yeah.
But it's still a good one.
Yeah.
And I'd be curious to listen to that on audiobook to see just, how it was completely divorced from its style. Mm-hmm. My guess is it's probably still pretty good.
Yeah. I wonder if they did could sort of craft it so that the volume, obviously you can't play with the range too much because people wouldn't be able to hear it, or they'd be turning their listening device up and down to compensate for it. But if they added some sort of just a gradual volume increase, decrease as the person was reading it, that would actually be pretty cool too.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have the audio version of this. I should get that.
Yeah. And then the next story is very timely, I guess, or current, because it's called Twittering from the Circus of the Dead. This is a story that could not have been written 20 years ago or 10 years ago, I guess even. But it's basically a horror story told through Twitter messages. And in a way, it's sort of an epistolary tale, but done in real time. So it's kind of cool. It's a gimmick story, but it was all right.
Well, it comes from the era when Twitter was still kind of a new thing.
Yeah.
The story actually is 10 years old, believe it or not. It first came out in 2010.
Wow.
And I found it charming that Twitter was a new enough thing at that point that he had to put in an explanation of what Twitter was right at the beginning.
Yeah. But in time, 20 years from now, Twitter might be gone. So then people would say, what's this Twitter thing he's referencing? So maybe it will provide benefit for future readers as well.
We can hope.
Yeah, for sure. So is that all you got to say about the story?
No, I mean, I thought it was a really good story. It's another one where it's, as much as anything else, an experiment, but it's a pretty cool experiment. It's kind of like the prose version of a found footage horror movie, where it's almost surprising nobody else had ever done that, and maybe somebody had, and I just don't know about it. But I remember reading it years ago when it first came out, and just thinking, man, this is cool.
Yeah.
I still pretty much feel the same way about it, I would say.
Okay. Very good. And probably the next story, Mums, is probably one of the creepiest stories, I think. And this is, trying to remember all the details about this, but it's a play on the word mum, because it's not just referring to his mother, it's also referring to plant life as well, flowers. So do you have a good handle on this?
Yeah, it's about a teenager whose father is a militia type guy. And not just that, sort of like a survivalist and separatist.
Okay.
And his mother dies under suspicious circumstances that the kid finds out more about as the story goes on. And then I don't think it's even his great-grandmother. I think it's like somebody way, way older than him shows up to lend a helping hand, which involves, how do you put this, growing a new mother?
Yeah.
So what the story is about is this kid just trying to get out of the circumstances of his life, and there being kind of a supernatural means of doing so. And yeah, it's another one that, like everything else in the book, I thought it was pretty great. I will say this is one of the stories in the book, one of the few actually, that if you happen to not be a fan of Joe Hill's politics, which I know some people aren't, this might not be the story for you.
Right.
But he and I seem to roughly be on the same page, so that didn't alienate me, but it might others.
Yeah. The politics didn't bother me either. It's actually a pretty good story. I quite enjoyed it. Though I'm confessing, I'm flipping through the pages and I'm having trouble recalling the details as I'm going through it. The whole idea of growing a new mother is definitely an intriguing one for sure. In the Tall Grass, talked about that one on previous podcasts, so I'm not going to go over that again. I will say that and we also talked about that in another podcast as well, is the adaptation of the story for Netflix is significantly different than the short story. So if you haven't read this short story and only seen the Netflix version, I highly recommend that you track down a copy of this story and read it, because it's a much more surrealistic tale than what Netflix did with it.
Yeah. Whether
that's good or bad, that's what you'll have to decide on your own.
Yeah, I wasn't a huge fan of the movie, unfortunately.
No.
It's okay. It's lower middle tier. It's better than every Children of the Corn, but
yeah, mostly saved by
Patrick Wilson.
He was having a blast just playing this mentally deranged lunatic character. So he basically saved the movie for me.
Yeah, he's great.
Yeah, he's pretty cool. So then that leaves us with You Are Released.
This is the one that's on the airplane.
Oh, yes. This is a fantastic story as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, do I remember correctly that you and Hans talked about this when Flight or Fright came out?
Yes, and it was the best story in the collection for sure.
I thought so too.
Yeah.
And that's despite the fact that many of the stories were, classics.
Yes. Yeah. This story has multiple characters and pretty well with maybe one or two. All of them are relatable and sympathetic, and you can empathize with them. So that's why the story worked for me so well. and plus, he gave each one of them a different voice in the story, which is pretty amazing to do in such a short piece. Really, it was it's a mastercraft in handling point of view and characterization, and of course the concept of being on a plane as the world is being annihilated below you is pretty interesting as well. And I should just mention that I'm watching a Netflix series. It's called Into the Night. It's kind of the same thing where the people on a plane have to keep flying ahead of the sun because if they get exposed to the sunlight, apparently it will kill them. So that's kind of the interesting story. I don't know where it's going to go yet because I haven't seen it all. So
is that a series? I haven't heard of that.
Yeah, it's on Netflix. It's only like 6 episodes. It's a subtitle series too. I'm not sure if it's German or something else, but yeah, it's pretty cool. And it's only like 6 episodes, and they're only 38, 40 minutes long each. So it moves along pretty briskly. So it's pretty cool. All right. So that takes us through Joe Hill's latest collection, Throttle. I've definitely preferred 20th Century Ghosts to this one, and inadvertently or because of this conversation, I think you nailed down, Bryant, why I struggled with this one so much is because there were so many unsympathetic protagonists in most of the stories. So the few stories that had sympathetic protagonists, I really enjoyed them. And for me, the last story, You Are Released, and Late Returns were my 2 favorite out of the collection. I thought they were both really well done and inspirational.
Yeah. We haven't actually even talked about one of my favorite things in the book, though, which is the introduction.
You got a thing for those, eh?
Well, when they're as well done as what Joe Hill can do, and he's doing one in the style of what Stephen King has often done in his story collections.
Right.
And one of the things that would make this of particular interest to Stephen King fans is the fact that the introduction is really all about Stephen and, to a lesser extent, Tabitha King.
Yeah, growing up with your dad as Stephen King.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, it's as good as most of the stories in the book, I would say.
Yes, that's true. I'm glad you brought that up. I have a tendency to skip over them when I'm doing the book reviews. But yeah, this for sure. This is if you want to peek behind the curtain of the King clan, this is definitely the introduction to read. And again, it's a pretty nice homage to his dad. And I'm sure his dad was probably quite touched by this when he read it. That is the Joe Hill collection. And now we're just going to move over to the latest release. And again, will be spoiler filled. So if you haven't read If It Bleeds, it's been out for about a month now, from Stephen King. And this is a collection it's kind of like a different seasons collection in that there's 4 stories, but there's not really any thematic overarching link between the stories. They're all very different from each other. And again, King, to me, just continues to, by the stage of the game, it's his ability to create characters just continues to impress. And 3 of the stories, I guess you could say, are pretty straightforward. The one story, which is really a collection of 3 interlinked stories, The Life of Chuck, is only experimental piece. And why don't we talk about that one first? Because it's something that you almost have to read twice, because the first time you read it, it's like, this doesn't really seem to be related, but it's basically the story of this character, Chuck, who everybody sees on a billboard, and they're congratulating Charles Krantz for his 39 great years of service for the company that he worked for. And this character, who's only on the billboard in the first story,
I feel like he's not really present in the story, but I think there is a bit at the end where it sort of flashes over to
his family,
to him at the hospital.
Yeah, so his family's gathered around the deathbed of this character. And really it comes down to, I think it's the line that his son says, "And now my dad's world is dying." And basically everything that happened before that point in the story is this world that we think is a real world, or just a normal world. It seems to be experiencing all these odd, strange breakdowns. If like California's fallen into the water, there's crop failures, electricity's going out, the internet's failing. And by the end of it, we realize that this is the universe that exists inside Chuck's head. So I thought that was pretty cool. And then the other 2 stories, I don't know how to parse them exactly, but I guess it's just saying that if you know a person as one thing, because like everybody, like when you read the first story, because he's set up to be like this almost like an accountant or whatever. Everybody thinks that he's this boring character. But the next story turns out to show that he had this inner life or previous life when he was younger than that, and he was like a really good dancer in that. And I just found the whole, because I know King loves music, so I'm sure he had fun writing this, but the description of, and again, this has to do with the act of creation, whether it's writing or whatnot. There's that magic that happens where you zone out and become this other creature or person or whatever, or you go to another world. I think it's captured here in a way that King's never, because traditionally when he's done it, he's always talked about the act of writing. So I thought that this story was actually pretty cool. I'm not sure what did you make of it, Brian?
I thought it was really good. One of my King reading friends did not like this at all. And he felt it was just sentimental and hokey and not really believable as either one of those things. That's not how I felt about it, though. I felt very differently about it. And one thing, to me, I don't think in this version this is happening all that long before Chuck gets sick.
Mm-hmm.
I think Chuck, when he dies, is only 39 years old.
Yep.
So here's how I looked at the middle story.
Mm-hmm.
It's mentioned somewhere in there that he's just started to have headaches. So he's badly sick and doesn't know it yet.
Right.
This is probably the last time in his life that he dances.
Yeah.
And he does it without knowing that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's him recapturing a moment that he'll never have again without knowing that he'll never have it again.
Right. Yep.
And I found that to be a very moving concept.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I'm also somebody that, like, I the amount of things that I know about dancing, you could write in. You find the tiniest space that is possible to find, and then shrink it, and that's where you could write that, because I can't dance.
Yeah,
but I would like to.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of took it that way as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really responded to the second act, and I seem to maybe be a little outside everybody else's experience with this one.
I could see that, because it is hard to equate this Chuck guy with this dancing, but I've found that in my life a lot of times, that there's people, when you see them, you can't help but, judge a book by its cover. And then when you find out that they can do something that you never would have expected, that's a real big surprise. And I think it's also universal level. There's something inside each of us that we had an event or a moment in our life where things just came together, and we were more than what we were in that moment than we would ever be again in the rest of our life. Lightning in a bottle, a moment of magic, something that where you just, no matter what you did, it turned out right. You couldn't do anything wrong. That's a rare alignment of events for people. So I think that's also what King was to write about as well. So he chose to do it through dancing. Where that came from, I don't know, but maybe he saw some videos of street musicians and whatnot, and just maybe that sparked it. I don't know, because I've watched some of those, and that's pretty cool too. Sometimes, like, you see people gather around somebody who's not a big star or whatever, and something magical happens. It's pretty cool sometimes.
Yeah.
So we're talking about Act 1, I Contain Multitudes, which circles back to the third story. And this is basically where we find out that Chuck, his parents were killed when he was young, and he ended up living with his grandparents. And in the cupola of the house, the grandparents say that it's haunted and that he really shouldn't go up there. And it's full of ghosts, which is, I guess that's a metaphor for the human mind, though that's cool. And yeah, we find out from here, this is where he learned how to dance at a school, so that ties back into the second story. And after his grandparents pass away, he decides not to go back into the cupula anymore, which is an interesting decision. So it's all about the waiting. That's the hard part. And it's really just the origin story of the character and how those things all tie back into what happens in the second and third chapter.
Yeah. One of the most interesting things about this story to me is, and it's something that you wouldn't know unless you read the author's note at the end, is that King wrote them in the order that they're presented here. In other words, when he wrote Act 3, he sort of wrote it as its own thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like there was no intention to follow that up. But then he just felt like, all right, there's more here. And then he came up with the next two, which is, maybe there's something else that's similar to this in his body of work, but I'm not thinking of it. It's unique in King's work.
Yeah, so he's basically built up a backstory for this character.
Do you feel like it all hangs together?
I guess that's why I'm struggling with the first part of the story, because I'm scanning it and I'm trying to get the flow for it again. And it's just talking about getting this scar on the back of his hand, and it's his dancing. And I don't think it's flowing together in the way that if the story was told with the chapters in the proper order. I think this is more just jointed on purpose, maybe, because that's trying to capture how life doesn't always flow. Like sometimes there's jarring changes, right, between your various stages of life. But I'm probably just talking out of my ass right now. So yeah, I don't think it quite flows together, but it's an interesting exercise because he's basically created a character. I like the concept of we all have a universe in our mind, and when we die, that universe dies with us. So that's an awesome concept. I like that. And then the rest of it is the other two chapters are kind of like backstory to support what he wrote in the first story. At least that's the way I'm interpreting it. I don't know if that's what he intended.
Yeah. The only thing that I really struggle with the story is Act 3. And specifically what I mean by that is just taken on its own. If you take away Act 2 and Act 1, then I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I'm just not sure that I understand why these specific people are the people that are living in Chuck's brain.
Yeah.
And maybe it makes sense, maybe it doesn't. I don't know. But I haven't been able to fully put those things together. And really that's the only thing that's kind of holding me back from saying that this is kind of a masterpiece of a story, of a novella. If I can make those things connect, then this probably becomes one of my favorite things that King has ever written.
Yeah.
But I haven't quite gotten there yet. However, I want to put forth a theory of maybe a different way of looking at all of this, which is to speculate that the way Chuck contains multitudes is, to be honest, I don't think that I feel that way about most people. I don't think I contain multitudes in that way, for example. Lou, I don't know you well enough to know if you do or not.
Probably not. I got enough trouble work with just maintaining my own identity.
Yeah. I tend to think that most people probably don't in this way. However, I think Stephen King probably does.
I agree. I knew you were going to go there. I totally agree. I think as a writer, they definitely probably have these multiple universes in their head. But like you said, I don't think most people, beyond their immediate family and that, they don't really think or imagine such a vast and complicated universe as this is suggested in this story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in the case of Stephen King, I suspect that if you were to somehow be able to poke mentally into his brain somehow, you would probably find that most of his characters are still doing things in there.
Yep.
Somewhere in there, he knows what Barbie from Under the Dome is doing right now.
Yeah.
I don't know why that's the first character that came to my mind. So maybe that sort of presents a way to read this story where what the life of Chuck, the novella, represents is Stephen King's looking at his own impending mortality and saying, when I go, there's going to be a whole world that goes with me.
Whole universe or multiverse. Yeah.
In his case.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's probably a good way of interpreting it, because I definitely agree with you that I don't think a lot of people carry that much in their head like the story suggests, but a writer like him who's created so many characters and so many worlds, definitely all those worlds will go away when he goes away, at least in the sense of there being living, breathing things. I mean, we as readers will still have the stories, but we're locked in basically to the framework that he built for each story. So unless you do some fan fiction or stuff like that, this basically, it's a recording as opposed to the living, breathing thing that's going on in his head. Yep. Okay. Very cool. Thank you for the insights. I like that quite a bit. All right. So that's the most intriguing piece. The other stories are pretty straightforward, really. Mr. Harrigan's phone is a straightforward haunted object story, and it's interesting that King, his fascination with technology or the appreciation of how it is a double-edged sword comes back to play in here, because he's basing his story on the first iPhones. And he touches upon that further in his author notes about it. It's kind of like a monkey paws variation as well, in that this boy who ends up working for a retired billionaire is given an iPhone by this man. And after the man passes away, he's able to call said individual on his phone, or seems to be able to, even though that person has been buried and is underground. And each time the first time he calls him, because he wanted to hear the man's voice again, was inadvertent. He made a suggestion that seemed to be carried out in the real world, and the person that he was cursing ended up dead. And that was the bully, his high school bully, that was the victim. And then later on, something else happens, equally tragic, and deliberately this time wishes for the said person to be hurt, and it happens. And then he gets a warning about not using the phone anymore, because it could lead him to bad ends or to a curse of some sort. So it's not really clear. I just assume it would be a bad end. But it's a pretty straightforward story. But again, because King is so good with characters in that, I appreciated the story for what it was. But it's definitely a more traditional horror story.
This was, I didn't love this one, but it's very good.
Mm-hmm.
I would say it's the worst in the collection. Mm-hmm. And once again, it's one of those things where you're like, okay, well, what does worst mean in the context of a collection this good?
Yeah.
One of the things that I thought was interesting about it is that it seems like the thing that at first glance you might think was something that he had written years ago, around the time that iPhones first came out.
Yeah.
But it actually, in thinking about it, it really is more about somebody looking back on the time when that was a brand new device. And I think that separation of time is something that's probably pretty important to the story. Because, I'll confess that it is alarming to me that we're at a point where somebody could be nostalgic for an old smartphone. But yet, here we are. We are here. I may not have that.
Yeah, for sure.
But there are tons of people who will be curious to talk to somebody a little bit younger than myself who had read this story and see what they thought about it. Because it might land for them.
Yeah.
A lot harder. If that's the case, and that's just pure speculation, but if that's the case, then to me it's amazing that Stephen King would be able to do that. And this also kind of struck me as something that this is Stephen King doing Joe Hill. This to me seemed like something that Joe Hill might have written, apart from it having likable characters.
Yeah. Well, and that's the secret, I think. I do like how I think, because I think on another podcast somebody mentioned that one of Stephen King's strengths is that he's a noticer. He's a great observer of human behavior, and he's been endlessly fascinated, I think, with the advent of cellular technology. And that, I mean, he wrote Cell, and now he's touched upon it again in this story. Is even this character, this banker character, he's an old man in his 70s or 80s, and he gets a smartphone, an iPhone, for the first time, and even he becomes addicted to this device. And I think, King's fascinated with how we, as a species, really have become so dependent upon our smartphone and our connection to the internet and whatnot. And this is taking it to the nth degree, obviously. And I love the last part of the last line where he says, the character says, "I do know two things, however, and they are as solid as New England rock. I don't want to be cremated when I go, and I want to be buried with empty pockets."
Yeah.
I think that's pretty funny.
Did you see the conversation that King had with John Grisham?
Yes.
There were a couple of things in that actually made me start to appreciate this story a little bit more.
Oh, okay.
King mentions at some point in it, he more or less says that he's addicted to Twitter. And not just to Twitter, but to just being online in general. And he says at some point that he gets so many notifications and stuff on his computer when he's writing that sort of, serve as distractions, that And I don't think he quite came out and said that this is the reason why, but he did say that his writing has gone down from about 2,000 words a day to 1,000 words a day. So I put all these things together, and it sort of feels to me like King is probably a little bit on the regretful side when it comes to technology. I think he probably loves the things about it that he loves, but also sees it as something that isn't entirely a good force. And I think all of that is in this story.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I remember him saying that. Of course, he blames it on getting older, but I think that there's definitely a kernel of truth about if he's got Twitter popping notifications up while he's writing, that's got to be distracting, especially being who he is. Like you and me, like how many Twitter notifications would we get? And I hardly get as few as it is, but I've always turned them off because I find it annoying and distracting to have my phone constantly beeping or warbling at me, when I'm out and about, and I don't want to read that stuff until I'm at home or whatever, or I'm in the mood.
Yeah,
so
I'm the same way.
It's interesting that King leaves his notifications on, but maybe he doesn't know how to turn them off.
But I think he said in the talk with Grisham that he doesn't know how to turn them off, which like I want to call somebody and be like, can you not get somebody over to his place to turn these?
Get one of your grandkids to get one of your grandkids to show you how.
Yeah. For the betterment of all of us, let's get those notifications turned off on Stephen King's computer.
Yeah, I mean, and he's working on the book right now, and he said he had to change the story, and it's going to be interesting going forward with this coronavirus. Like, are writers going to set their stories during this social distancing era, or are they going to, because unless you're writing speculative fiction or something like that, you have to sort of like pick a date in the future and say, this is when we pulled back on the restrictions. What are you going to do for the time period where it's actually in effect? But then on the other hand, I'm just thinking of all these story possibilities people could have with the fact that because of social distancing, the fact that you're not seeing somebody for a long period of time, it's not going to raise red flags as much as it used to, right? Because you keep it to yourself and that. So there's a lot of tantalizing possibilities of stories.
Yeah.
Especially for thriller writers, I would think, that they could write right now. But yeah, we'll have to see. That was an interesting interview. With the good thing though is like when you see interviews like that, and because this was just like a couple of weeks ago, is that you can see King is still operating on with a full tank of gas mentally. Like he's sharp, he's very articulate. And it's like he hasn't lost anything in the mental department. So I'm always just watching him talk and say, okay, he's still got it. Like, because as people get older, they tend to, slow down or lose the ability to focus and whatnot. But he seems to be doing all right.
Yeah, not to be morbid, but I think it goes with what we're talking about. King is old enough that if he were to start really dropping off, honestly, it's not that big a surprise.
No.
But yeah, absolutely. That interview was terrific and showed that's not happening with him. Yeah. And frankly, even if we didn't have that interview, we've got this book that proves it.
Yeah, for sure.
Because this is to me at least, it's all very sharp stuff. So personally, it feels to me like we're probably Stephen King's going to outlive me. At this rate, which is fine by me, quite frankly.
Yeah, but then I think, what if he writes something that you never got to read?
Man, I won't be around to know it. So it's just. But I do feel like we're probably going to get another 20 years out of this guy.
Yeah,
I think he's just that good.
Yeah, I mean, and you really have to count as a fan, and really have to count our blessings, because I mean, there's like a lot of people that would have had that accident that he had when he was struck by the car, and that would have been game over for him. Like for most of us, like we would have dwindled and away and floated off into the wind. But he fought back, and in some ways it made him a better writer, I think, once he found his footing again. So, all right. So we've got two left. Let's leave If It Bleeds till the end. The next one is Rat. And again, I remember a Harleen Ellison story about a writer that couldn't write, and he made a deal with a bunch of elves or dwarves or gnomes or something, and basically he was telling the history of their world, and it took off, and he became a famous writer because of it. And this story has the Stephen King flavor to it because instead of dwarves or elves or whatever, it's a rat. Why he picked a rat, I don't know. Do you have any idea why he would pick a rat? Is this?
I would say it probably just seemed like the rat thing to do.
Oh, God. Yeah. I set you up for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I did that.
Yeah, you did it.
No, to actually answer the question, I have no earthly idea.
Yeah.
But it worked for me.
Yeah, it did. But it's like, this is such a strange character or creature to pick as a source of inspiration. So
it's probably got something to do with the fact that most people take rats to be something to be afraid of.
Right.
So it kind of adds a little layer of dread that, if it were a bunny rabbit or something, it wouldn't do.
Yeah.
Or what else could it have been?
Yeah.
Talking Pomeranian.
Yeah. It's a good story. Again, King is drawing upon his writer experience because the main character is an English teacher, and he's trying to write, who's good at writing short stories, but always chokes when it comes to writing novels. And it's always interesting for me to think of, like, as a writer, what would be more fulfilling? To be able to write one great novel that everybody likes, or to write a ton of novels that are generally well received, but will any of them ever really be remembered? I don't know. Like, what's the trade-off there?
I think it would depend on what you wanted out of being a writer, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
and it's not the money.
I feel like the way Stephen King probably approaches writing is, I don't have to speculate on this. I've heard him say things like this, that it's something he has to do.
Yeah.
That it's a compulsion, that it's almost like something that you have to sick up.
Yeah.
It has much better connotations than that in his case. But so I think for him, he would probably almost look down on what Drew is doing here, because he would feel like he's focused more on the forest as opposed to the trees.
Right.
Because he's not that kind of writer.
Yeah, exactly.
But maybe this is him just, and this is one of the things that really interested me in this story, which is the idea that King was looking at it and saying, all right, well, what if I was that kind of writer, though? What would that be like?
Yeah, for sure. And this one is, from a character perspective, out of the four pieces in here, this is my favorite one, because not only does he capture the creative process of writing, I mean, he's talking about how when you're on the money, when you're on the beam, the words just flow, and you don't have to stumble between choosing between words like jumped or skipped or hopped or whatever, that the right word just comes. Like, I think there's a thing in here where the character's struggling with a scene where all the characters are sitting on chairs, high chairs or something outside on the office. And then he says, oh no, we'll use a bench, and stuff like that. And
it was, it was rocking chairs, right? And what he got hung up on was, well, how could that many rocking chairs possibly fit in this tiny place?
But because that's, anytime, if anybody's tried to write, those are the kind of moments that you go through, and you get totally bogged down in this minutia that is 9 times out of 10, most readers won't even care about. But so I really like that aspect of it, that struggle with the creative process, especially when if you're a writer that has trouble getting the words out, as opposed to when you're when the muse is there and it's just you're just throwing coal into the fire and it's just steaming ahead with no problems. So I really like those pieces of it. And then I also like the description of his marriage relationship with his wife, and the battles that each one of them decides to stand on, and the ones they decide to retreat on, and just that unspoken communication between the two of them, or just in the way they say things, or what they don't say actually sometimes too. So I just really like the whole this character was really well drawn and felt like a real person to me.
Yeah, and at the same time felt like somebody who's probably not much like Stephen King himself.
Yeah.
Which, once again, here's Stephen King writing about writers, which is a thing that he's done how many times now? But once again, he finds a new angle into doing it. And for me, got great results out of it. I loved Rat.
Yeah, I did too. Yeah, and then he's talking again. A lot of times you hear somebody who is trying to write or whatever and says, I'm not feeling good today. I've got a headache, or, I'm feeling under the weather. And he's talking about like Flannery O'Connor had lupus, Stanley Elkin had multiple sclerosis, Dostoevsky had epilepsy, Octavia Butler suffered from dyslexia. What was a lousy cold, maybe even the flu compared to things like that? He could work through this. The bench proved it. The bench was genius. I just love that whole encapsulation of a spectrum of different writer excuses and frustrations with the creative process.
Yeah.
It's just, he's lived it so long. It's like breathing for him when he talks about it. And the horror aspect of it was fine. I didn't mind it. And a little bit of a twist as to how the wish was carried out, because you expect just one thing to happen, not two. So that was cool without getting into specifics of that. But it was a pretty fun story. I quite enjoyed it. And if I was younger, I probably would make a more of an impression on me. But again, this is a story that it's got that monkey's paw vibe to it. So it's not something totally unique, but it's got the Stephen King flair twist to it. But it's a pretty solid story. And I really do like the characters in this story quite a bit.
Yeah. And it's got that extra timeliness layer where it's about a guy who gets sick and is quarantined.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this could actually be a peek into the kind of thing that somebody like Stephen King will write once he decides to write about the era of COVID-19.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Because that's going to happen eventually.
It has to. That the 19 is staring him in the face. It's like, Steve, come here, buddy. Your 19 is right here.
So I thought it was pretty interesting that this came out in the midst of that.
Yeah. And again, he wrote it last year, right? So
yeah, pure coincidence.
Pure coincidence. But when you've got the GAN flowing, I guess you get that kind of insight or synchronicity. All right. So then the last story is If It Bleeds. And of course, this is dealing with Holly Gibney. And big spoiler warning here, because whatever's going to happen to Holly, it's not resolved in this story. This could be the end of her journey into the bumping up into the unexplained, or it could just be another case. But it's dealing again with the similar type of character that we had in The Outsider. This one's powers are a little bit different, and he gives Tyrone and his sister Barbara. So those two characters get a little more expansion, I guess you could say. And there's also references to Bill as well. And it's set up as that Holly is sending communications to Ralph Anderson from the Outsider story as well. And I know he loves the Holly character, and I enjoyed the story, but there's a dynamic with Holly that works better when she's not the main character in my mind. I don't know how you feel about that. It's character actors can't carry a movie, but they sure can make the lead actor look really good when they're just in there to do their little bit of shtick every now and then, rather than trying to carry the movie themselves. And I think this one suffers from that a little bit. I don't know how you feel about that.
I feel differently about it. Is what I would say. But okay. I see what you're saying. But for me, this was the first time that the Holly on the page has actually popped for me.
Oh, great. That's great.
It's not like I've ever hated her, but up until this point, I will confess that every time that I've heard that he's writing something new with Holly, my reaction has been to roll my eyes and just be like, oh God, we're still on this, huh? Okay, well, yeah. I'll still read it.
Yeah.
So to me, I became a fan of Holly reading this. And the only time that's ever been the case prior to this is watching the HBO show.
Ah, okay.
And I think it was specifically because we were in her mind the whole time. And so that I got more of a handle on what Stephen King was seeing her as.
Okay.
And I would kind of be interested now to go back and reread the Bill Hodges trilogy and see if I maybe feel any differently about her.
Right.
I don't think I would, but now she's part of a story that's continuing to evolve.
Right.
Which to me is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that it's not just happening with her. Like you said, it's happening with Jerome as well. And it was fascinating to me that in this, King has made Jerome a writer.
Yeah. Yeah. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I agree with everything you said. I guess the point I was making was I just think she's more effective when she's not carrying the story.
Yeah, I can see that.
Definitely. Like if Ralph Anderson was in this story and she was helping him with this, I think that would have been a better story. But I'm not saying, again, like you said, like this is still a good story, and I really do enjoy it. But it's kind of like the Dr. Watson Sherlock Holmes pairing. You need somebody bouncing off of her, and she's really carrying this a lot on her own all the time. And that's why I think King was using this device of her narrating what was going on to provide another viewpoint as to what was happening in the story, because she didn't have anybody to talk to. So she had to write it down to clarify how she was feeling about and thinking about things. So, but again, as with The Outsider, the final denouement of what happened to the villain in this story was okay. It was a little, that whole elevator thing was okay, really? Like all the doors are going to open on all the floors when I guess it's possible. I don't know if it's true or not. King says he researched it, but I still found that a little bit hard to swallow.
Yeah, I could see that. To me, like the plot, I didn't even care about the plot, to be honest. The plot was just the delivery mechanism for the character stuff.
Yeah.
Although I did enjoy the plot for the most part.
Yeah.
One of the things that I really liked in this is the manner in which Holly is able to get connected with the old guy who's done all the research.
Yes.
Which is that she had told her therapist, hey, I know you think I'm crazy. Maybe I am crazy. All I'm asking you to do is, if you ever hear anything else similar, just let me know. That's all I'm asking for. I thought that was pretty brilliant, personally, because that struck me as the kind of thing that a person could actually do.
Yeah.
And maybe it would work.
Yeah. Yep. And the old character and his son, I thought they were interesting too. And I really thought the son was going to come into the story, but then he turns out to be quite timid. So he pulls back out of the story. And I thought, well, maybe I thought King was setting up a new partnership with Holly, but that didn't happen. So that's too bad. And again, like that description of the older character, how he had that talent as a cop to recognize faces and his son has the talent of being able to work audio cues in the media. And Holly has the ability to see a big pattern and put things together, how there's some sort of force outside of them that's directing them to find this villain. I like that idea. Again, King's done that before in other stories, and I like that. I like that concept as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I liked both those characters pretty well.
Yeah.
Wasn't my favorite aspect of the story, I guess, because it did seem like, well, this is just plot delivery mechanism. But that's all right. As far as that sort of thing goes, I thought it was pretty well done. Yeah.
I mean, they were exposition dump characters, but at least they felt like real characters.
Yeah, true.
So I thought that was pretty well done. And the progression of Holly as a character, like her relationship with her mother and her uncle, he's suffering from Alzheimer's, so they have to move him to an old people's home. That was, I don't know, maybe that's King kind of, at his stage of life, he's thinking about that kind of stuff too. Maybe, I don't know. Though, as we mentioned earlier, he doesn't seem to be suffering from that kind of an ailment.
Well, I'm sure it's the kind of thing that he's probably paranoid about, which, honestly, same.
Mm-hmm.
So I would totally get that.
Yeah, and that's probably everybody's nightmares. It's one thing to have, die because of failing health, but to die of mental deterioration and not even really know that you're not who you were anymore that's so sad.
Yeah.
And it's such a terrible, terrible way to go. And it's kind of like that story he did with Batman and Robin.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Batman and Robin have an altercation. I didn't think about that. Good point.
It's breaking Holly's heart that her Uncle Henry keeps referring to as her dead sister who died in the Hodges trilogy. But I do like it, right at the very end when they're watching. And is this Judge John Law? Is this a real show in the States? Or?
I don't think so, but it feels like it could be.
Yeah, because it sounded like he watched too much Judge Judy or People's Court or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And
I'd forgotten about that aspect. I actually kind of laughed every time because it seemed like he really just wanted to write about Judge John Law.
Yeah. So that was funny, and then that was funny throughout the story. And then at the end, he used it for that touching moment when they're watching that show together, and Uncle Henry turns to Holly and says, "Hello, Holly," and that's the last line of the story. So it was a really. King just knows what levers and buttons to push all throughout the story. And it's probably the most fun piece in the collection as well. So, yeah, it's a very different 4-story collection than his different seasons. And what was the other one? Was it?
Full Dark, No Stars, and 4 Past Midnight.
Yeah, than those ones. So those were all really very discrete stories from one another, whereas this one was obviously, well, If It Bleeds is playing off of a trilogy or a quad trilogy, I guess, depending how you look at it, if you think of Holly as being in all the stories, and that experimental piece with The Life of Chuck. The Life of Chuck. It's always funny when, especially in a year where he only releases one book. I always just, as soon as I finished this, I said, man, I can't wait for his next full-length novel now, because it's kind of cool to read these shorter pieces, but then it always really builds up my appetite for give me a 1,000 novel that I can really lose myself in for a couple of weeks kind of feeling.
I'll be curious to see if he ever writes another one of those.
Yeah.
My guess is he probably will.
Yeah.
But who knows?
Who knows? And then will he write another Holly story? I don't know. And how is he going to handle this whole social distancing thing? He's going to have a story about toilet paper hoarding in it or something? I don't know. Or something about hoarding or something.
I wouldn't rule it out. That's the thing. Going back to what you said about the idea of Stephen King being an observer.
Yeah.
That brings to mind 2 things for me, which is, number one, it might mean that he's limited in the amount of things that he's observing during this time. So that could actually mean that he doesn't have all that many ideas come about. On the other hand, it might mean that he's observing even more things. And I could see it going either way. My guess is that he probably is observing quite a lot of things that are making him think.
Yeah.
That'll probably result in at least short stories.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like everything else with this whole situation. We're just kind of waiting to see how it's all going to shake out.
Yeah.
There's no way it doesn't affect him.
No. He's dying to go to the movie theater. You know that.
Yeah.
And he misses baseball.
I know the feeling.
And he misses baseball. Yeah, I'm sure you would. And he misses baseball, so there's that too. But yeah, I could see him writing stories about the difference between getting all your relations through electronic internet means as opposed to face-to-face meetings. I could see some sort of story coming out of that, but we'll have to see.
He'll write a sequel to Under the Dome where everybody is in their own individual domes.
Yeah.
Please don't do that.
No. Did he didn't give super details about his next book, did he? The only thing I think that he mentions is that he had to rewrite a section because people went on a cruise, and he said that wouldn't happen during the time period. Then he just moved it back a year or something like that.
If I'm remembering correctly, what he said during the talk with Grisham is that he does have one book already completed that's a crime novel with...
That's right, yes, no supernatural.
No, I think this one he said does have some supernatural aspects.
Oh, okay. All right.
And he said something about it maybe being published as... I thought this was a little unusual. He mentioned it possibly being published as a paperback.
Maybe Hard Case Crimes? No.
Yeah, maybe. And then the thing that he's working on now, I think is what he said has no supernatural elements, and it's about, I believe he said it's about a hitman.
Interesting.
And that's the one that he had to change the chronology a little bit to account for somebody, not being willing to go on a cruise in 2020.
Right.
Whatever it is, I'm excited for it.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, we've been going at it for quite a while. I want to thank you once again for coming on, and I hope everybody has enjoyed our views about these two books, and hopefully you'll all have a fun reading them if you haven't. And I look forward to hooking up with you again down the road again sometime, Brian.
Yeah, you bet. Appreciate you having me on.
Thank you, sir. You take care and have a good day, and go enjoy your night event.
Will do. You too.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right, bye.